Right, in this video, we'll be looking at Cnidarian physiology, so a little bit more about their life cycle and more about their body plan. So let's talk a little bit about the life cycle. We talked about asexual reproduction in the previous video with budding, and you can see here how this polyp is kind of budding. It's almost like a plant, think of it like that, but it's not obviously not a plant, it's an animal. And so this polyp is reproducing through budding, but it's also reproducing sexually as well. And so typically the Medusa stage here will be the sexually reproducing part of this, but not in all, because some cnidarians do not have a Medusa stage. And so very similar sort of thing that happens in other organisms that reproduce sexually. You have meiosis, which produces sperm and egg. One of the terms that will be specific to Cnidaria is this idea of the planula larva, and the planula larva is a motile kind of larva that can, even in strictly polyps, the motile area or the motile planula larva will go find a place to go, and it can make other polyps which can reproduce asexually or sexually. The Medusa here is free swimming, and it can reproduce through budding or a process called strobilation, which I believe I have a picture for. I do. And so here's the polyp, and you can kind of see here, and I mentioned this in the last video, where you have kind of this upside down stack of these Medusa, and they will kind of just break off and swim away and then can reproduce sexually. They are able to occupy the benthic regions of the ocean, which is the bottom, and this would be mostly your polyp stages, and then the pelagic region, which is kind of the water column, then would also have the be able to go all throughout the water column. Most of the jellies that we see are in the tidal regions, which kind of thrive there, but jellies are found all over the ocean. And some, again, like I mentioned, some life cycles lack a Medusa stage at all, and they're able to just reproduce without a Medusa stage. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the body wall. This is kind of a close-up of this body wall section. The outer layer is an epidermis, and this comes from the ectoderm, which we mentioned earlier. The inner layer is what's called the gastrodermis, which is from the endoderm. The their bodies are able to move even without muscle tissue. They don't have any sort of true muscle tissue. They have these cells called epitheliomuscular cells, which aren't on this particular picture. And these epithelio muscle cells are on the epidermis, and they will actually contract, which causes the body to move. There is this inner stuff called the mesoglea, which is between the two dermal layers, and this acts as kind of an elastic skeleton. Think of it as giving the animal structure, but also lots of flexibility, and it will produce these amoeboid cells that we saw in the sponges. Remember, in the sponges, they were called archocytes, but these amoeboid cells will kind of travel throughout the space and function as stem cells and serve other functions as well. So the cells that kind of the claim to fame for these animals are called cnidocytes, and cnidocytes are where their little stingers are. And a little bit about the cnidocyte here. The cnidocyte is the cell that produces the structure called the nematocyst, and the nematocyst is actually the harpoon, so to speak, that will inject toxin into the prey. And typically, this toxin is made to paralyze the prey to keep it from moving, so that the cnidarian can insert the prey into its gastrovascular cavity. It's for a slow, long digestion. You can see here, this is kind of the tentacle and each of these little triggers. That little trigger fires, and it fires out the harpoon, which injects the poison into the prey. And you multiply that times a couple thousand, and the little fish or whatever it's eating is no more. So here's a picture of this. Looks like some sort of some sort of like amphioxus or something, some sort of thing that's getting eaten by this jelly. That jelly is going to have a hard time sticking it in there, but I guess it'll work. Um, so polyps can do this as well. So we typically think of this sort of thing, but polyps are carnivorous. They will catch prey with their tentacles and push them into their stomach. Medusa have the mouth on the other end, and at the end of that mouth is a tube called the manubrium, and the manubrium is kind of like the beginning of the mouth, and this is where digestion will actually begin. I probably have a picture here of that. I do. So you can see here's kind of the tentacles around this particular one don't have very long tentacles, and they have these arms that extend out, and think of the arms as what grab the food and pull it in. And this is the manubrium, this structure out here. And then there's the gastrovascular cavity, or the stomach is what this picture calls it. All right, so a little bit about the nervous system of the cnidarians. Not really a nervous system per se, because there's no centrality to this nervous system. It has what's called a nerve net, which is a very diffuse nervous system, but it is still a system of nerves that are able to collect information from the outside world and allow this animal to respond. The nerve net forms on both dermal layers, and so you have it on the internal and the external, and they're interconnected. The way that this is designed is it's different than like a central nervous system. The nervous impulses are going to travel in both directions, and they are connected to sensory cells. The ocelli and the statocyst that we mentioned in the previous video. Statocyst will allow the cnidarian to sense kind of up and down, or like gravity, whereas the ocelli will allow them to sense light, and they can kind of respond to their environment. But they're not able to think or process. They just have one little thing that they do. Cnidarians will move towards shadows, for instance. They can see where light is not. Well, what does a shadow represent? It represents possible food. And so that's kind of the thing. They don't attack their prey more than they just kind of move toward them and hope that their tentacles brush across them. And that's kind of the way that they work. They do have a kind of neuromuscular system present, but it's it lacks a processing unit. So it's more like a mousetrap. A mousetrap doesn't think when it's triggered. It just goes. And there's one more word that is used here, and I don't really think I have a picture of it. And it's called rhopalia, which is just a group of nerves and sense organs. It's the beginnings of a centralization to the nervous system, or what we're going to call in later videos, we'll call it like a ganglia, which is a group of nerves.